In World War II, there were many heroes. In the haze of war, there are many brave exploits, of men and women, from both sides of the conflict. Many of these exploits have faded, and have been covered by that same foggy haze, and all but forgotten. Forgotten, except for the few, who were participants in these long-forgotten events. Today, we'll tell you about an unsung hero, who ran through a wall of fire, who disobeyed direct orders, and risked his life to save an enemy soldier, under fire, on the field of battle. Our hero never thought he was doing anything heroic, let alone ever be remembered for it. To him, it was just the right thing to do. Sergeant Friedrich Lenz was a medic in the German Wehrmacht, the German army. He was attached to an infantry company, in the 275th Infantry Division. On a cold day, on November 12, 1944, in a little-known place, named Hürtgen, Germany, a battle was raging. The battle in the Hürtgen forest was actually part of a larger, more famous battle, the Battle of the Bulge. Fighting between the Americans and the Germans had been fierce the day before, with no clear side having the advantage. Both sides were cold, short of supplies and pretty much beleaguered. Throughout that evening, a wounded American soldier could be heard shouting for help. The wounded American soldier was in what was known as no man's land, between both armies. That morning, the shouts were starting to grow weaker. Sergeant Lenz had been listening to the shouts all night, and couldn't take it anymore. The sergeant asked his commanding officer if he could go out and rescue the wounded soldier. The CO denied the request, it was far too dangerous. Besides, the CO added, it's just an enemy soldier, who cares? Sergeant Lenz decided on his own, his duty as a medic, as well as his moral compass, did not include only helping his wounded German comrades. At 10:30 in the morning, Sergeant Lenz, loaded up with as much medical supplies as he could carry, jumped over the berm, then started to crawl, the 100 yards, over open ground, to tend to the wounded American soldier. When the sergeant had crawled about 50 yards, he was spotted by a group of American soldiers in the trees, on the other side of the no man's land, and they started to fire on Sergeant Lenz. Of course, the German soldiers started to shoot back at the Americans, drawing some of the fire away from Sergeant Lenz. During his crawl, Sergeant Lenz was shot twice, once in the thigh, and once in the forearm. Despite his wounds, the immense pain, and the fierce shooting, Sergeant Lenz continued his crawl to the wounded American soldier. The sergeant's original plan was to stabilize the wounded soldier, and leave him there, in hopes that his own men would rescue him. However, the wounded soldier was in bad shape, and the sergeant knew he would not survive without a doctor's treatment in a hospital. With bullets hitting the ground all around him, he patched up the wounded soldier best he could. He began the 100-yard crawl back to his lines, while also dragging the wounded American soldier with him. In the process, Sergeant Lenz was hit 2 more times. With both men now losing blood rapidly, it was only a matter of time before they both would lose consciousness. Sergeant Lenz knew if he lost consciousness, the wounded American soldier would not be cared for, so he forced himself to stay conscious, and argued with his commanding officer to promise to get the wounded American soldier to a hospital for treatment. When the CO finally agreed, the sergeant passed out. When Sergeant Lenz regained consciousness, he was in a hospital bed, along with many other wounded German soldiers. When he asked about the wounded American soldier, to his amazement and relief, he was told the American soldier was in the very same hospital, and was going to survive. When Sergeant Lenz had recovered, and was being released from the hospital, he found his way to the area where the American soldier was recovering. The sergeant didn't speak English, and the American didn't speak German, but the American did recognize the man who had risked his life to save his. Sergeant Lenz wrote a note in German, and handed it to the American, and left thinking they would never see each other again. He was right, they would never see each other ever again. However, he could have never imagined how important that note would be. 50 years after the war, Sergeant Lenz, now Dr. Lenz, received a letter postmarked from the United States of America. The letter was from a Mrs. Holder Webster. The letter was a thank you letter for making her life possible. You see, Mrs. Holder Webster said, I'm the daughter of PFC, William Holder, the American soldier you rescued on that cold November day in the forest. In the letter, she told how her father was sent to a POW camp when he was released from the hospital and returned home after his prison camp was liberated. Mrs. Holder Webster said, she was born 1 year after her father returned. She said, he seldom talked about the war. But one story he did tell was how he was rescued by an enemy soldier who saved his life while risking his own. She had no idea who the enemy soldier was. Her father had passed away the year before, and while going through his things, she had found the note the then sergeant had given to her father while he lay in the German hospital bed. He had kept it all these years. She had the note translated, and the sergeant had written his address on the note. It took a year, but Mrs. Holder Webster was able to track down Sergeant Lentz, now Dr. Lentz. Mrs. Holder Webster and the doctor, now in his 90s, were able to talk to each other via the computer and meet face to face, virtually. Dr. Lentz had learned to speak English and told how, after he had recovered, his commanding officer wanted him to be court-martialed and kicked out of the German army for helping the enemy. But the army was short of medics, so they sent him back to his old unit. Dr. Lentz passed away in 1999, and Mrs. Holder Webster, at the invitation of the doctor's family, attended his funeral. Mrs. Holder Webster flew to Berlin, Germany, and met Dr. Lentz's family, 2 daughters and 2 sons. The doctor's wife had passed away the previous year. Dr. Lentz's wartime compassion just proves how doing the right thing may be hard and even dangerous, but doing the right thing can shape people's future in ways you couldn't even imagine. Even a small thing, such as a hastily written note that had been out of sight for over 50 years, can change lives. Dr. Lentz is a true, bad-ass hero.